It is, with this lecture series, my deliberate aim to establish new connections and liaisons between diverging fields of expertise and knowledge within the arts and beyond, and within the school and beyond, and within theory and practice. Today, I am on many levels super thrilled about our guest, Ute Meta Bauer, both on a professional level as well as on a personal level. When I graduated from university in 2003, my very first job was to be a curatorial intern of Ute. And actually, one of the many tasks I had was to assist you during your, I think you had a visiting professorship at the Berlin University of the Arts. Art in Context, maybe? Yes, as part of Art in Context. And we did a workshop with Akira Suzuki, and you took me along. So actually my first time that I came to the UDK was in 2003, 2004, on your side as your curatorial intern. So it's kind of a beautiful loop that we are now sitting here, and I have the honor to introduce you. And since then, so it's almost 2 decades, we've stayed in touch, and you've always been a role model for me, and you've been a mentor, but you've become a good friend over these almost 20 years. So it's special. It's very special for me to have Ute here with us, and that you're actually also in Berlin, and that's thanks to the good timing of the cultural season of the Berlin Biennale and the Documenta happening. Maybe before I give a brief, summary of your CV, a few more personal notes. I think that in many ways my entire practice has been deeply inspired by you, Ute, both on the level of kind of understanding that curator could be an interesting option, just future-wise, job-wise, but also seeing how important personality and personal connection is. That's something that you have taught me, just to be oneself, but also to really foster personal connections with the people that you work with the artists that you work with. But I have seen you've always had very close relationships too. So it's beyond just the working thing, but it's also on a personal level of importance. Secondly, I believe the connection between theory and practice that you represent for me, that there was always a very keen interest in theory, art theory, but always in an applied manner, always in connection to the artistic practice, which then led thirdly to this very open and transdisciplinary approach that is characteristic for your practice, and which has influenced me to this very day. Also working with artists, working with architects, working with sociologists, researchers, just a whole spectrum of artistic investigation. And fourthly, and last but not least, the connection to education. That for me, you were always a curator that has always been involved in education. That was a kind of very important pillar of your practice in kind of working with students and kind of bringing the discourse further. So that's my homage to you. Ute, we always have very different generations here also of artists or cultural producers. You were born in 1958 in Stuttgart in the south of Germany. You studied at the Hochschule der Bildenden Künste in Hamburg. You are founding director now of the Center for Contemporary Art, the CCA in Singapore. A beautiful place that you also invited me to speak a couple of years ago, which is a national research center for the Nanyang Technological University, the NTU, where you're also professor for art at the NTU School of Art, Media and Design since 2013. So it's been always a decade now that you're in Singapore. And from 2012 to 13, for a brief excursion, you were the Dean of Fine Art at the Royal College of Art in London. From 2005 to 2012, you were Associate Professor for Visual Arts at the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. You were also founding director of the program in Art, Culture and Technology, and director of the MIT Visual Arts program. Also Here, I think I came twice on your invitation, no? I believe, to MIT. So there's always, it's even more beautiful that now I can invite you here to be at UDK again. And before that, you were teaching for many, many years, I think almost 10 years at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. As I said, when we met, you were curator of the 3rd Berlin Biennial. Right now, it's 12th edition that opened last Friday. Just before that, you were working on for the Documenta 11 in Kassel. There's another rendition now happening, basically starting this week. And then many, many more projects and large projects that you curated and you worked on. The most recent one was in Venice. That's the last time that we saw each other, where you curated the Singapore National Pavilion for the 59th Venice Biennale. That said, Ute, I'll move to your presentation now. And again, I'm overly happy to have you with us here. So warm applause for Ute, please. Now I feel old. Sorry, where's the... Yes, okay. Thank you.
Du mal reingucken willst?
Ja.
Hast du mal?
Deine Notizen habe ich dir geklaut.
Hello. Oh, okay, it is loud. Sorry, I have like a severe cold, so bear with me. So I'm a little bit having a cold, so I hope you understand me properly. And thanks so much, Lukas. I mean, as you hear, I mean, I studied art myself, and I think it's also very interesting that this Juxtaposition series is about cultural production, because the question is always, is the curatorial or like artistic practice, are they really so separate? So for me, it's also very important if we do work, it doesn't matter if it's art or writing, etc. Usually we want to reach out, not always to a big public, but we kind of want to communicate something. And to me, it was very important very early on. I studied stage design also in Hamburg. It was really about like, what do we communicate? What kind of space do we open with what we do? What kind of sphere? What kind of exchange? And I studied at a pretty liberal, I would say, not neoliberal, but a liberal art school, a 68 kind of model. We were never in a fixed class. You could float around from A to B. I mean, as I said, I did stage design, but then ended up in visual arts, and we had film, experimental film, so I also learned 60mm film and editing. We had video. So it was a pretty free float school. I don't know if we learned anything in particular, but I think what we learned is how to spend the day. I mean, what do you do with yourself? As an artist or as a producer, that's really, really very difficult. In the beginning, when I was in the school, it was very often, what do I do today, or what do we do today? And we very quickly organized ourselves in a collective, because it became much more interesting having these exchanges. And what I will talk today a bit about is, some of you hopefully go and see Documenta, some of you might have seen Berlin Biennial, and I think what Kader Attia introduced, he was running a space before in Paris, La Colonie. It's what kind of space can artists generate? What kind of spaces do we offer to a society? And with Documenta, it's curated. The artistic directors are Ruang Grupa, which is a collective from Jakarta. So I want to talk a little bit about this kind of collective mode of production. There has been quite some criticism, as you might have heard. It's not just the entire debate if they're anti-Semitic. It's also, which they're of course not, but it's also, I think, what we really see here, and it might be good, we have a discussion afterwards. It's this notion also of the German press about Deutungshoheit. It's like who has the right to define what is art, and Documenta is of course one of our biggest art exhibitions next to the Venice Biennale. It's inventing each time itself anew, and suddenly there is this collective from the global south with a very different attitude and with a very different understanding of art. And I think this whole clash that we see at the moment has also to do with this. It's a very different understanding of what kind of role does the art play in their contexts. And so they invited many other groups in different places in the world where you basically not necessarily have the infrastructures that we have. And so I will speak a little bit about the area where I am working at the moment, and it's like Southeast Asia, but it's also Southeast Asia Pacific, which belong together, and it's also a region we don't know so much about. It's like there's not so much communicated, and particularly with the Pacific, it's more difficult, but there's also very interesting artistic production, and of course one field that is immensely pressing in our region is climate change, is the climate crisis. I mean, if you see islands submerging, atolls submerging, people losing their homes, climate change is something different than what you read in The Guardian or in the newspaper. It's very much in front of your door. And so I just wanted to bring maybe a little bit of the context from where Ron Grupa is coming from. And I think with this, one might also understand a little bit better their position, what they try to do in Kassel. So I think what they really want to bring to this is also a different way of spending time together, a different way of exchange, and a different way of communicating and sharing with each other. And I think that's a very interesting model for me. Also because, I mean, of course it doesn't replace other models. I mean, there's many different ways of artistic practices, of theaters, of film genres, of writings. It's not this versus that. It's really, what is this multiplicity of voices and of spaces we also can use for ourselves? Yeah, it's also very interesting coming to the Pacific. I work a little bit more there because of a project I have been involved in. And I realized how many colonies actually Germany had in the Pacific. I was not so aware, particularly also my home county, Baden-Württemberg, which is not exactly at the ocean. And I didn't know they have colonies, as you see here, German protectorates, even in Papua New Guinea. The Bismarck Sea is up there, so, which is very interesting and not so much known. Also Singapore had German coffee plantations, also something that was new to me. And to a certain extent, it was also connecting me to a different period. I would say, I mean, we are more familiar with Second World War, etc. But like First World War and the configuration of that period was just not so familiar to me. Yeah, I just wanted, as I said, I wanted to jump into the significance and importance of collectives and spaces, artist-run spaces in our region. So in the 90s, because, I mean, for example, Singapore, which is a very affluent city-state, is very high-tech, it's very modern, but 50, 60 years ago, it was tremendously poor. So it's a financial hub today, it's very successful, it's not exactly a democracy, but it's a very open kind of city. It's hard to see where the kind of like control structure lies, because it feels it's a super modern city. But for example, the Singapore Art Museum got only opened in 1996, and the National Gallery with a modern collection only inaugurated in 2015. One wouldn't imagine this in such a high-tech, modern city-state. So the arts is something fairly new. So what you would have had, for example, the Artist Village that got started in 1988 was founded by an artist, Tang Da Wu. He studied in the UK, he got confronted or like exposed to land art, etc. And he brought this kind of like new understanding of the arts, doing something outside, working with your environment to Singapore. The Artist Village was at the former chicken farm. Way back, there were still chicken farms in Singapore, and it was already a defunct farm. And also German artists were there, for example, Veronika Radulovic. I don't know, some of you might know her because she worked a lot in Vietnam and published also books on Vietnam art. And she was first also part of this Artist Village. We also had the substation. That was the first artist kind of like run space. It got started by Kao Pa Kun, who was a playwright, and he was for quite a while in jail because he was very progressive, very critical to the new state that got founded, and so many artists in Singapore found themselves actually in the 90s still in jail. Singapore had a performance ban that started in 1994 until recently. Also, that's something one would not assume if one comes to this very, very contemporary kind of city. Yeah, and then, like as you see, like Indonesia, also the Indonesian National Museum hardly has any funding. It's a kind of open air, pigeons sitting in the space, and so it's again more artist-run spaces, like Taring Padi. They come more from woodcuts, wood prints, very inspired by Käthe Kollwitz. It's more like older group. They will also be in Kassel with this documenta. Then Kunci is more a theory space in Yogyakarta. Yogyakarta is kind of the artist city in Indonesia. Many artists live there, and because the rents are cheaper, and I don't know if anybody ever was in Jakarta, but if you want to go from A to B, usually please reserve 4 hours. If you just want to go from the city center to meet your friends, the traffic is unbearable, and Jogja is a kind of bit of a village, so to speak. Yeah, and then you have in Manila, Green Papaya. They just shifted to a new space that got founded by PV, Roberto Noldan. It's also an archive on many artistic practices from the Philippines. Has been the biggest collection of artistic practices there, because in lack of institutions. Unfortunately, they had a fire in the archive a few years ago, and we really tried to, all of us sending them publications again so they can restart their archive. Then you would have Sasa art projects in Phnom Penh. So all of these spaces are kind of, is where the artists meet, where they do shows, where they make educational formats, they have workshops. It's basically where they get together in lack of institutions, often in lack of art educational infrastructures. There are often no art schools at all. Like in Cambodia, there is one school in the middle of the country, which is a very traditional school. So these institutions also are often the educational infrastructures that these young people have. Yeah, here you see the Artist Village. Is very interesting. This is kind of like, that was the chicken farm, so they did performances, burning stuff, like sculptures, like, I mean, it was a very lively moment. And you see here, for example, Amanda Heng. Here she's already a little bit older, but it's quite interesting because performance has a ban in Singapore, and you cannot even one person, if you demonstrate, even one person is not allowed to demonstrate. I didn't know you can do a one-person demonstration, but obviously you can. So what she did, she made this kind of performance where everybody has to carry a shoe in their mouth and walk backwards. Because, I mean, who can forbid to walk backwards? And, I mean, you can keep your shoe in your mouth. So So she said, it's not a performance, it's just like movement. So it's very interesting how the artists also engage with this. Here you see Tang Da Wu, that was a performance. He made a jacket, don't give money to the arts. He was wearing this when he was meeting the Prime Minister. So, I mean, the artists have, in that days, they have been super inventive, getting their messages out, and is, yeah, to me, it has been super inspiring also to see and to understand what can you say if you cannot speak. You know, our region has a lot of censorship, but the censorship is not like where you often imagine it to be. And you also realize that we have censorship. You know, like suddenly you kind of like, I was at MIT before, nudity was an issue because we have students from all religions. So we could not exhibit anything that showed a naked body. And so you also realize when you think there's censorship, you suddenly reflect also, do we have censorship? And going through this debate at the moment with Documenta, I would say we also have censorship. It's like certain topics here are also very sensitive. There are a red flag, and we kind of always circumvent these. Yeah, and I think the biggest challenge is always self-censorship, because we kind of internalize what doesn't go. Yeah, this is the substation. The substation has been in a substation, so it was a power transformation hub, and it had a theater. There were a lot of music. I mean, basically Malay heavy metal. There were many concerts. Singapore also had a very vivid punk scene and metal scene, but also it had a theater. It had studios on the top. It had dance studios. It has an archive. It had a gallery, and unfortunately, it got closed last year because of renovation, and it was already communicated to them when the renovation is finished by the National Arts Council, they have to share the space with others. And so there was a big uproar, and they basically decided to close initially, but then there were many protests from younger artists and basically urging them to stay open, but they have to figure now out what to do, because what was the beauty of it, they had this building, so you could apply with them if you get some space. Now you would have to apply with the National Arts Council. So they wanted to be a control-free space where basically the committee, which is all artists, would decide what can be shown. And it's actually quite shocking. Now we have more museums, but we have much less artist spaces. So, I mean, there are studios, there are small presses, print presses, design studios, and so that are open, but it's no more so much this kind of regular space like you would have had with the substation. Post Museum is another group, so it's not like the Post, it's actually just like beyond the museum. And one of the founding members, it's Wun Tien and Jennifer Teo and Wun Tien, together with Charles Lim. They were our youngest participants in Documenta 11 from Singapore. They had a group then called Tsunami.net, and their work way back was they had an antenna and they tried to find the server of Documenta. So they would walk through the whole of Germany with this antenna detecting where the server actually is, and it was in Kiel. So they walked 2 weeks through Germany until they finally found the server. So they came also from this kind of performative kind of like action. Yeah, Los Gens is a group in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. It's also a group of younger artists. It's a more recently founded one, 2004, about 20 years old. And so they really, I mean, as you know, like Malaysia is also a Muslim, mainly Muslim country. There is Chinese minority, and so there is also often racial tension. And Los Gens also just tries to keep up an open space for younger artists to have workshops, to have debates, to engage with each other. and literally be a space. So all of these groups have such an important role at their location, because there is nothing else very often. I mean, Kuala Lumpur has a museum of art, and they do also here and there contemporary exhibitions, but it's not like a place you would go and see the exhibition, but then you go out. I mean, it's not like a place where you would hang out or meet anybody. Yeah, and here we have Taring Paddy, I mentioned already, they come more from woodcut. They were a very politically engaged group from the beginning. I mean, like, you cannot see it now, it's behind the projector. It's, for example, they had a project, How to Fight Corruption, which, of course, in the Global South is a topic. Monies are trickling away, and very often it is exactly the reason why the population doesn't have so much infrastructure, because the money stays very often with the wealthy, kind of the more affluent upper class. And so they were really always very political and very outspoken. And they were also kind of inspiring for the younger, I would say, the younger initiatives. And what Ruang Grupa also does is, what I think is very interesting, they also honor the older groups that have been there. So it's not just about the very contemporary, but really also bring in these earlier groups who basically also inspired them in a way. Yeah, Kunchi, I mentioned already, Kunchi Studio. Kunchi is a theory organization. They have a huge library, they also have a residency. You can go there, stay with them. Almost all of them in Indonesia are also residencies. So, I mean, also my curators went there and they said they want to research, so you can stay with them. They have a guest room, they do stuff together. So, yeah, as you see, it's the classroom is burning. Let's dream about a school of improper education. But they are super theory savvy. I mean, you see the group. Some of them are wearing veils, some of them don't, and I think that's also something to understand, that wearing a veil in our region is not so much enforced, it's more by choice. So if they want to wear a veil, they wear. If they don't, they don't. So it's not necessarily enforced by the families, etc. So that was also something new for me to learn. I have some of my staff are Muslims, and they would also live, they would pray every day, they would follow the Ramadan, but it's by choice. So that was also something, yeah, that I newly discovered, so their relationship to the different religions. Yeah, they also do always collective farming. So Jogja is quite rural, and most of them also engage, they would have small restaurants, etc. So it's a bit more villagey kind of location. Yeah, then Ruru. Ruang Grupa, Ruru is art. So the Ruru house that you have in Kassel is the art house. So it's basically, so they always create an arts house wherever they go. And in this house, everybody can do stuff together. It's a space for everybody. It's a non-hierarchical space. It's usually open 24/7, and you just can hang out. And I don't know if you read, the Ruang Grupa also said, like, what is very important for them is called Engrang. That means hanging out together. And I think even Andreas Vanitzade from the Taz freaked out, which you wouldn't expect maybe necessarily. And he said, what attitude is this, hanging out? I mean, that's not an art form. That's a bit too simplistic or so. But actually to hang out and spend time together without a plan is not that easy. You know, like letting your ideas flow and so, and it can become in the beginning quite boring, and then you have nothing to say anymore. But then slowly, often the ideas come. So I think this notion of like unfilled space, unstructured space is actually very important also for you guys when you study art. I think it's very hard usually to spend time when you don't know what to do. I mean, for me that was one of the hardest things as an art student, when I didn't know what to do. Do I do painting? What do I paint? When is the painting ready? And so at one point I gave up on painting and did videos that was a bit more structured. So it is tough to do those practices. It's really, to be self-determined is actually something very difficult and very challenging. And I think many people who are not in the arts don't understand this. That self-determination is actually quite a big challenge. Yeah, Ruan Gruppa also. Ruan Gruppa, they started also about 20 years ago, OK Video Festival. And then they also took over from the Jakarta Biennale, which already existed. So Ade Damawan, one of the founding members of Ruan Gruppa, he was also the president of the Jakarta Biennale, which is always a biennale on art and urbanism. It's usually in the city, it's integrated. Sometimes it's in a parking garage, or like it's also partially in a museum. So it occupies many spaces. And so they actually, because many people said like, how can they do something like Documenta? I mean, they're just running this small space. No, they were running the Biennale in Jakarta since many years. And they also were the curators of the last Sonsberg exhibition, which is kind of every few years. At the moment, Bonaventure is curating it. It's every 4 or 5 years, and it's an art and public space kind of project in Sonsbeek in the Netherlands. So they also curated that, so they're actually quite savvy in organizing bigger events and bigger amounts of people and spaces. They just do it differently. Yeah, Baku Padan is another group. They also come more like from, you have, in particular in Yogyakarta, I think is the biggest density of artist groups. So they all have a slightly different focus. And some are a space, some are more like a guest house, some organize exhibitions and have small shops. So, but it's always collective, and you will also hear the word in Kassel, ecosystem. So they understand the arts always as an ecosystem. The art is part of society, and you need an ecosystem. Why? Because you have to finance yourself, you have to survive. So you need an ecosystem. How do you make your income? And so how do you distribute the money? Is it shared? So it's very interesting, and what you will see in Kassel is really a lot of discussions about the ecosystem. So they also have the Kassel ecosystem, where they worked with many groups over the past 2-3 years. So several of the members live already since 3 years in Kassel, and they're really engaged with the communities there to build up such an ecosystem. Yeah, that's Batu Padan. So this is a group that is together with 2 Dutch artists. They moved a few years ago to Jogja to take over Cemeti, which is one of the oldest artist-run spaces that also got founded by a Dutch artist, Mela Jasma, and her Indonesian husband. She came for a residency 40 years ago there and just stayed. And this younger group, they wanted to be a bit more discursive, more political, and talk also about sovereignty, bodies of power, and really, I would say, is maybe a bit more political than Cemeti was, which was more a space where you share infrastructure. A little bit more like the classical artist-run spaces where you might in the past had video equipment or print machines or like lithography, silkscreen, etc. But they really, again, want to share more a discourse. So it's really quite stunning to me how savvy all of these young groups are in theory, how well read they are, how many books they have, which is not so easy. To get books in our region is super expensive, so this is why they also share. Yeah, Nasan Collective. Why I'm actually in Singapore also has to do that in 2004, in that period I worked in Norway. We were establishing, it's called Office for Contemporary Art, which was a support structure funded by the Ministry of Culture and Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Culture, and initiated by several artists, among them Sissel Tolas, who is based in Berlin, Norwegian artist Bente Stokke, who teaches in Kiel at the Muthesius School, and Anne-Katrine Dolven. So they said we also want to have an independent structure for support, and I was then invited to prepare the cultural program for a state visit, and as you can imagine, that is quite a challenging task and very rigid by the protocol. So I always wanted to come back with more time because it was actually quite fascinating. And I met way back Nasan Collective, which was then joined by Veronika Radulovic, who I mentioned before, who was part of the substation. She's initially from Bielefeld, but she was teaching 13 years at the Art Academy in Hanoi, and was teaching a whole generation in conceptual art, which is very stunning if you come there and have all these conceptual artists. And they have, is a tribal house that some of the members of Nasan Studio transferred from the north of Vietnam to Hanoi, and that was their kind of meeting point and where they would hang out. Nasan Collective are the kids, is the younger generation of Nasan Studio, and I think they are now at the 5th location. Currently they are without, because the police always closes it. So many of them have been, particularly the Nasan Studio, the older generation, they do performance art mainly. Most of them have spent always every here and now stints in jail. The younger ones are not jailed anymore, but they just close their space. So it's not exactly that they have complete freedom, but they also never know what is the red line. You know, you don't necessarily know what goes, what doesn't go. It's very unpredictable. Sometimes it's just for bribes for the police. Sometimes you stepped over a line, and but they're kind of used to it. They said, well, yeah, then we go to jail, but after a few days we're out. That was also interesting for me, like how they said, yeah, it's just part of our lives. As artists, we go to jail here and there. In Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, was a very different art scene. I mean, as you might know, Hanoi was north Vietnam, which was communist, while until the Vietnam War, or as they call it, the American War, the South was under the American occupation, and so there is kind of also a divide. So the Hanoi scene and the Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City scene were not exactly friendly with each other. That has changed. Today they collaborate, they work together, because they also realize they have to join forces. So because the Saigon scene was mainly younger artists who had left. They were boat people. They studied in the US. Andrew Chuan, he's also now at Hamburger Bahnhof with a work at Berlin Biennale about Senegalese soldiers who joined the French wars. So he looks into this history also of kind of like colonial armies, and also refugees, etc. And so as they were mainly kind of like Viet Kieu, as they call it, coming back from the US, like Dinky Lee, Tiffany Chung, and so there was a bit of a friction between those who stayed in Vietnam and couldn't go, and those who were abroad, which they thought are spoiled, or like they had a good life out there in America, there were more freedom and so. But I think today that changed completely, and they're really in very close exchange. And Sun Art is a space that exists also now almost 20 years. And again, it was founded by Dinky Lee, Tiffany Chung, and the Propeller Group, as they were called. Andrew Tuan is member of the Propeller Group. They studied the Propeller Group. They studied at Cal Arts, for example. And so, yeah, to have like a space also for the local artists. Again, they have residencies, they have a library, etc. Yeah, Phnom Penh, Sasa Art Project. It's also they are moving, because like depending on funding and spaces get shifted. So usually all of these groups are roaming. So they're always for a few years here, and then they move to the next place, etc., depending what kind of budgets they have. What was very interesting, one of my former students, she's Indonesian Cambodian, but grew up in New Zealand. When I met her, she never had been in Cambodia. And then she started to go back. Complicated family histories, as you can imagine. The whole family, the first family of her father got killed by the Khmer Rouge. And so it was very emotional for her to return with her father, actually to Siem Reap. And then she developed a project, and that was for local artists from Cambodia, but also other artists could join from anywhere in the world, and they would travel through Cambodia for like 2 weeks as a kind of a roaming seminar to really understand the country. So it's also very interesting, of course, how those who live abroad also return to their home country, the diaspora. And there's often tension between the diaspora and the locals. And it really takes some negotiation to come together. Yeah, so they also are kind of like a school. They are doing collective seminars, but they also do public screenings. They had also a residency in a modern housing complex by, no, I forgot his name. He was a student of Le Corbusier and was building the whole of the more modern part of Phnom Penh on invitation of the king and then the crown prince and Jan Molivan. And so they had a residency there, but the white building, which was administrative houses, got torn down in the meantime. And so now they have like another space. So they always also would invite international people. They're hosting. I mean, when curators come from Western Biennales, in the past, I could invite people to come until Singapore, and then we would always help them to organize their regional trips, which then they paid themselves. But once you have the long distance flight, it's so much easier to travel within Southeast Asia. And so we have a very good network there. So it's a very tight-knit community. We all know each other pretty well. And this is also, I think, what you will see in Kassel is Ruan Grupa kind of extended this kind of network to Africa, to Copenhagen, to Palestine, to Latin America, to really look into around the world what kind of like collectives, what groups are existing, what kind of infrastructures do they contribute to their place, what can they learn from each other, what can they exchange together. And also they created, which they call Malesi. So it's kind of 9 kind of subgroups, and they gave them each 220,000 euro. And then these subgroups could decide how do they spend this money, like what they want to do as a subgroup with this money. So it's also a complete different distribution of the resources of Documenta, which of course in the beginning the administration had some issues, because of course you have Bundesreisekostengesetz, and everybody who works here in administration knows how strict all these forms and regulations are, and then suddenly you have somebody who says, we give them 220,000 euro and then they can spend it as they like. That was a bit of a shock for the administration, but actually then they learned, they're very well organized, and they also said maybe also the city of Kassel can learn how to distribute their money differently to people, because it empowers also people to take more ownership of the place they live and take more responsibility, instead of always thinking, oh, the state should do that, or like somebody should fix it. And so, because they come from infrastructures, if they don't fix it, it's not happening. So they say there's also maybe you can learn something from us. Yeah, Green Papaya was also one of the oldest artist collectives in Manila. They also would organize concerts, so they have many rock bands. Music plays an enormous role also in Indonesia, in the Philippines, and so there would always, I mean, you will see if you go to Kassel, there will be a lot of jam sessions. Many artists also have bands, and it was a bit like here in the 80s when people would be in a band, but also in the art school, and so it's much more mixed still. So, I mean, we had one artist in residency, Saleh Hussein, also from Jakarta, and then he said, in Singapore, in our residency program, he said, fortunately, he has, if we allow him to leave, he has a few concerts to play. If they were pre-planned before he came to us, and we said, yeah, sure. And then I asked, where is he playing? What is he doing? They're playing stadiums for 10,000, 15,000 people. I had no clue. I knew him more like as an artist doing drawings. So, I mean, they have serious audiences, so they're really out there, which is also very interesting, and it's also often a way to distribute income. Yeah, so they also do regular concerts, they have restaurants, so it's always a complete infrastructure. Ilan is a single artist. You see her here. Ilan is Malaysian, but she would say she is from Sabah, which is Borneo. So Borneo is still occupied. There is Brunei. Then there is the north, which is Malaysian. And then there's the south, which is Indonesian. So Borneo is still occupied. And Ilan belongs to a movement which is called Free Sabah. So she's part of the independence movement, and she works a lot now with local weavers, with women collectives. So they're making these huge kind of like mats, which are kind of like demonstration mats, which she also puts up in museums, etc. She is a gallery artist. She's very successful. She works with Silverlands, which is one of the foremost galleries in the Philippines. So it's also not that you are either or. A number of these artists are very well selling. They have galleries, they're out in the art market, they have been participating in Documenta before. So they are also not all unknown. But then they have also still a very generous practice where they work with their community. That was for me very impressive to see that they feel responsible for their community. In Yogyakarta, for example, most of the senior artists mentor the younger artists, have studios for them, give them studios, support them in also financially, etc. Because there is no network. So they feel also this mentorship is very important. I mean, Lukas, you said this before, but I think it's also something that I experienced. I mean, the senior artist generation, I was very fortunate who also supported me, also more senior curators gave me my first opportunities, and I think it's not like that just somebody knocks on your door or you send a letter. Usually it comes through mentorship. Marta Atienza is another artist who is actually quite known. She won Art Basel. She got the Art Basel Award also in the market, also with Silverlands. She's half Dutch, half Filipina. Her mom lives in Batayan, which is one of the islands, and She works there a lot with the local community. She also got stuck in COVID there and started to work with the community on recycling. And she is now the official person who has to deal with plastic recycling of the islands. And it's not like something she wanted to do, but she started these projects like of collecting the trash and recycling the plastic, because like she said, she just was there and saw how much the islands got polluted. It comes from the ocean actually with the currency. It's not like that they pollute the island, it comes usually from the ocean. And then the local officials, they kind of like asked her if she can be the representative. But she also, this was a video for which she won the Basel Award. This was an underwater demonstration. So they would work with banners underwater and also demonstrate about the condition of work. Usually these young people live from, they do free diving and they usually do hose diving. So they have a water hose and go deep down. They don't use compressors like a diving gear, which is very, very dangerous, because like you really destroy your kind of lungs on a longer run. And she's very concerned about the use there, because like they not necessarily know that they do this since centuries. It's the way how you dive. And so she also tries to pay attention that these kids basically get like gear or are like properly paid, etc. So again, she studied at the Rijksacademie, but she lives back in Batayan. With her mother and with her brother, she works a lot with her brother. She's also in the book. Her brother is a lawyer, so they also work together and trying to really also look into legal structures and policies. Yeah, here you see it. So this was kind of the underwater demonstration. It's a beautiful piece, like when you see this whole demonstration procession underwater, and she filmed it with an underwater camera and in costumes, etc. I mean, they're super creative and like really try to get the attention also of an international community, because the money usually comes from an international community. Locally, it's very difficult to get money. Yeah, this is where Batayan is. Our region, like Indonesia, I don't know how many thousands of islands. It's one of the biggest Muslim countries in the world, 280 million population. It's kind of like 4 times more in Germany. These are vast regions, like, and we don't know so much. Also, the Philippines is an incredible diverse region, also politically diverse. You might have heard of the conflicts, Timor-Leste, West Papua, in the case of Indonesia. So, I mean, there is tension, Aceh, for example, also in Indonesia, which are kind of like groups that try to break away from kind of like what is still a colonial, post-colonial mapping. So these countries, I mean, I go a lot to the neighbor island, which is Indonesia, but actually the population is Malay. But it was split after the British left and the Dutch left, so they kind of like would redraw the map, like this goes to Indonesia, this goes to Malaysia. And so we still live, the conflicts are also coming out of this kind of like colonial maps that are not necessarily following the tribes or like the communities. So they force often like communities who were not exactly friendly with each other to be under one kind of like rule. Yeah, Taloy Havini is, Taloy comes from Bougainville. She lives at the moment in Brisbane in Australia. So many Pacific Islanders who study art are either in New Zealand or in Australia, because again, there is no infrastructure back home. So they would basically live there, but she goes very regular back, and Bougainville is kind of like, again, most of the islands always have been exploited. Phosphate, sulfur, gold, rare earth. today it goes more and more into deep sea mining with technologies advancing to get rare earth out of the ocean, which is another big threat to our climate and to the planet. And it's really, I mean, if you see these destroyed landscapes, I mean, the colonies, basically the colonizers, so to speak, the occupiers leave, but they leave very damaged landscapes. Yeah, and a lot of conflicts behind. And many of the artists there actually are engaging and is trying to bring more attention to their places. And I mean, before I was invited to work on this project in the Pacific, I also didn't have a clue. I mean, it's just very, very far. It's like they don't have much connection across because flights are very expensive. And so there is some kind of isolation in the Pacific, and that makes it also easy to exploit. Yeah, Newell Harry is an artist. He's born in South Africa, he's from Mauritius, but the family lives in Sydney, but he works a lot also in the Pacific. He also works in Bougainville, in Vanuatu, and really looks into the struggle of the locals, like who really still come to grips with what is left over from this colonial rule, and also the conflicts that are instilled by that. And so they try to be advocates, introduce more what's going on there. Also, Newell Harry was 2015 in the Venice Biennale in the main exhibition, All the World's Futures by Okwi Enwesor. He also was in a documenta. So again, these artists are out there. He also has a gallery, actually quite known gallery, Rosalind Oxley in Sydney, but nevertheless he spends half of his time in the Pacific working with the communities. So they kind of repurpose also their income and bring it back to the communities. Yeah, and then we can have a bit of a conversation.
Thank you so much, Ute. Maybe in the backdrop we put something else. Yes. Thank you. You can stay on stage. I would say, I mean, break or not, I see people nodding. Do you want a break or shall we just continue? I'd rather be for continuing, otherwise we leave half. So let's stay with this. Thank you so much. Also wonderful that you were able to contextualize the now opening documenta in a whole legacy of kind of collective practices in Southeast Asia and Pacific. A lot of also new information, I guess, for many of us. And I'll start with the first question while you guys can think about your questions, which brings me again to the notion of collaboration or collective working, which is something that I'm trying to push with this format, but with all the other educational formats here at the Berlin University of the Arts, of kind of thinking more in collaborative terms, that kind of all of cultural production nothing happens in a vacuum. It happens in a dialogue, it happens with a lot of different players, a lot of different expertise. So apart from the collectives that we just saw and the traditional legacy of those, now you personally are constantly collaborating with very big teams, whether as a professor or a director or educator. What's your biggest learning in that, in working with large transdisciplinary teams, people with very different fields of expertise? Because it's not an easy one. Collaboration is always nicely said, and collective work is also beautiful, but it's also a challenge. It needs training in a way. So what's your biggest learning?
I mean, at the moment I curate with the artist Amar Kanwar and the art historian David T, the Istanbul Biennale, and we really are very different. I mean, I was first invited and I didn't want to do it alone, but we really have very different. Not the interest is the same, but like very different approaches. But that's really actually good because we constantly throw ourselves out of our own comfort zone. So David is a bit more I would say, really interested in art practice, and in the aesthetics of it. He's an art historian. He really engages in that way with the artists. He really follows them. He wrote a book about Thai art. And Amar is an artist. He's very interested in collective processes. So he would work with a group of poets, Turkish poets, on a poetry book, which he called Poetry Channel. He worked with a group of the Syrian refugee cafe. He worked with them on war stories because he's interested in this collective process. So I'm more like the curator. So for me, it's like, initially we didn't know, will we have a Biennale because of COVID? Now we suddenly have a Biennale. So what do we do? So, but I think it's really important because, I mean, all of us also work alone. I mean, if you write a text and so like you're on your own. So it's not either or, but I have, for example, also Documenta 11 with Okwi and Visor. We were 7 curators. And in the beginning, we each had our section, but already after the first meeting, we decided we do everything together and don't split. And it pushes your boundaries. For me, it doesn't mean you give up who you are or like what your interest is, or you still contribute with yourself. I mean, you're still existing, yeah. But I always had the feeling it pushes me further. You know, it gets something out of myself I couldn't even imagine I could do. So I work very often for exhibitions, because I really love to make exhibitions, with an exhibition designer, because for me it's very important how an exhibition looks. I'm very much a detailer, and so if I work with a really great designer, I often work with the same designers for all the collaterals. It's very important. Every brochure for me matters, because it represents what you want to say. So this kind of collaborations for me are more a holistic way of expressing what you want to get across. And I think, as you said, like collective processes are not easy. Even Ruang Grupa, they had other members and they would split. And I mean, I can say that they split because at one point it was also about income. Like, can you, I mean, if you make income, is it shared? Like, does it go to somebody? And Ruang Grupa said, no, the income always is collective. And then some members who thought at one point, after 20 years, they also want to make a bit of income, so some of them split. So it's not so easy, and I mean, I also was in an artist group, and first we were 7, at the end we were 2. So it's not for everybody, and then your life changes, but I think it's this fluidity. It doesn't need to be either this or that. But because I did stage design, so you work collectively. There is a theater director, then there are the actors, then there's the stage designer, then there's the dramaturg, you know, so the same with film. So you have to negotiate with the cinematographer, with the editor, with the sound person. But it makes I think it makes the project better. Because you have to say why you want to do something. You know, and even if you say it's my intuition, you still, you know, it's not just a given. And I think it pushes you, and I think that, yeah, that's something I really benefited a lot. And I'm super curious now with Kassel, how this will function, you know, like with how this functions with, I mean, they expect usually up to 1 million visitors. How does this function with 1 million visitors? Can there be collective processes, you know, or does it become an exposure of collective processes and so? So I'm actually quite curious, but I think I don't know, Lukas said to me, you come all from different kind of areas. So, I mean, if you're architects or in performing arts, you always have to collaborate. And I found it always very hard as an artist, because as I said, I first studied art, to be alone in the studio. Until I realized it's actually not for me. You know, others love it. So, or some really love to write and be alone and write. You know, we are all different. But I had to recognize, for me, it's not for me. I still love art. And so curating, which didn't exist way back, I mean, we would organize exhibitions, but the term curator didn't even exist. So we would still organize projects, and I realized that's actually what I like to do.
Yeah, beautiful. How about you guys? That's the first question already, yeah.
Do we need a mic?
No, if you speak up loud, then we can hear it via this one.
Okay, I wanted, first of all, thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask, because you've been showing so many different collectives and how they all can work differently and all persevere or not, and I wanted to ask, in your opinion, what you would think make the elements of like a healthy, functioning collective or artist group?
I
Good
think
question.
it's always a very, I say, the collectives I know, they go through really intense processes. It's not easy. But it's very stunning, for example, around Grupa, they're together 20 years beside of the two people who split off, which are also friends of mine. So they are still friendly with each other, but they just split. But it is quite an intense process, and sometimes the groups go a bit apart, like, I mean, Tsunami.net, Charles Lim and Tian Woon, with whom we worked for Documenta, they don't talk to each other anymore, so, you know, it also can get frictions. So I think it's not an easy process, but I think it's a process that is very worth just to test. I mean, when we were art students, for example, we decided at one point, we moved to the art school. We had a kind of, our studio was a former, Turnhalle? Gym. That we had an additional building because the school was too small in Hamburg. And we thought that's ideal, there are showers, everything, like why don't we understand a collective process by moving in, locking ourselves in. So we locked ourselves for 1 week into this place. I mean, it's something you go through as an art student, you know, like you want to test things, and that was actually very revealing. It was a very intense experience, and I have to say, like, that's 40 years ago, and we are still very close and friends. You know, like, because I think today the field became so competitive for artists, you know, like you constantly compete, and there are so many artists, and you have to survive, and there are stipends, there are grants, there are like, so it's very, very hard. And to really overcome this, that you actually benefit maybe if you're not competing, is a very big revelation.
Another question from you guys. Yeah, then we do go here and then back to you. Yes. You go first.
Yeah, I have a question about what you were just talking about how you came to curation, that it didn't exist when you started, and I just was interested, like how you found yourself doing curation when you studied art. Like, what was that transition, and how did you find your way to into what you do now?
We would basically, like, you know, like the year-end exhibition, we would do also collectively, so some person had to take charge. So, and I usually love to do that. So, you know, how the space is looking, etc. And then I realized more and more, like, that I really enjoy that, to arrange the works in the space, but then even like what space, and how do the audience comes to that space. And then, I mean, it has probably to do, because I did stage design, which you deal with an audience in theater, you know, like, so this notion of an audience is always very important if you're in theater, or also film. I also did film. And so I think I really liked to organize. We did also festivals and so. And I think then slowly I realized it's actually something I do like. But it didn't necessarily exist, so I became a director of an artist-run space in Stuttgart, and it was always directed by an artist. You know, then it was just normal. And then only then, it became too complicated for people. They always said, like, slowly the term curator came up. Then they said, what are you? Are you an artist, or are you a curator, or is your art curation? And so, and then I thought it becomes too complicated, and just said, whatever, I'm a curator.
Follow-up question there?
Just bouncing off of what you were saying about different collectives, and how you, for example, founded a really strong connection with a collective or group of artists you were part of through staying together. Would you say that physical proximity is an important aspect to artistic community, or just your thoughts on this?
No, I mean, I just thought way back, for women, it was also not so easy to be in the art world. So we were several women, and I remember way back, actually quite a known gallery in Hamburg were interested in us, but then they said the problem is with female artists, they don't know if we last, so to speak, and it's to build up an artist takes time. They invest in an artist, and then they said then they get pregnant or like they stop working, and so they said they're always very hesitant, and a group might split, so we said, forget it, we just do our own stuff. It's too complicated. But it was just that we had much more fun to do stuff together.
But in a sense, the question was also of physical proximity, so to speak, of being close, like no?
The same space.
In the same space, in particular now that there's so many online communities.
I would go for a while to New York, and so we were not always in the same space, or I would say you spend time together and then you do your own stuff again, or write, so it's not like that we did everything together. It was more like on certain things we would meet and do stuff together, but then it was also important to think on your own, to sort yourself again or come to terms with something. So you also need your own space.
Yes.
You said that you transferred from painting to making movies, so I enjoyed that. So I'll be interested in what kind of direction that you were interested in your movie making, or if you still do that.
Painting is for paintings you have to be super patient. I mean, of course, when you started with oil paintings until it dries and so on, and it was just for me like a too slow process, and then I thought, no, video, and so it's you can do much more, and you can have sound, and so I was much more interested in it was then a bit a new medium in these days, and we just started we had still 60mm, which I also learned. So we basically would do everything. We also did silkscreen, etc. But I just felt my highest respect went to the painters, because I thought it's such a solitary work, and you have to be so super patient and everything. And as I said, until today, I really highly respect painters. And but it was just not for me. I was way too impatient. But you have to learn it. I mean, I was next to the class of Sigmar Polke with all of this today known painters who were his students, and they would stay the whole day there and paint and so. And I thought, oh my God, So it has to be for you.
Speaking of art schools, if I throw a question in between, what would you say, having studied art yourself, what's the biggest thing that you learned from studying at the art school, and what's the biggest thing that wasn't taught to you, which you realized kind of having graduated from the HFBK, like a life lesson? You're like, wow, how come that I was never taught this? So what's the biggest learning in school, if you think about it, and that influenced you, and afterwards?
We wasted a lot of time, because way back you study a long time, and I thought at the end when I left, at one point I didn't learn anything, because we would always hang out, and not necessarily with one fixed teacher, so I remember I did then postgraduate studies in art theory, because I wanted to learn something, and I had the feeling I didn't learn much. In the art school, I only realized later what I learned is really to be self-determined. But then I didn't realize that this was actually the biggest thing that I learned. Nobody told me what to do, and I thought it's really bad because I didn't do much. But then I realized actually it was not so little, and to basically motivate yourself to do something, I realized that was actually the biggest thing. What I didn't learn, and which I later, when I became a teacher in Vienna at the Art Academy, I really taught my students to write. Because I thought it was horrible, suddenly people asked you, can you give me a CV? I didn't even know what is a CV. So since my Abitur, or like the baccalaureate, we wouldn't write, and suddenly our school, I was the first generation who did a diploma, and we had to write. And we were suffering. Because it's a practice too. If you don't practice it, if you don't do it regular, it's a pain. And then I thought, I don't want this for my students. So when I started in Vienna, I was the head of the theory department, and we really would read a lot and also write. And then I said, if you don't want to write, it's fine, but at least you know how to do it. So that was, I think, the biggest thing which I regretted, that we never learned that.
Actually, one of the exercises here in this lecture series is that each week, if you want to get a credit points, you have to write just a personal reflection about the session. And this is not, you don't have to go in depth or write a theoretical treatise, but just the exercise of sitting down and writing is so important to kind of get more used to it. That becomes a habitus almost.
Yeah, I think it's really there's so many different ways of writing. And so we teach creative writing also now to our students. We make also workshops for artists in Singapore who already finished school, so that they can come back, and we invite often artists, then poets, and so to really see writing, there is many different styles of writing. And I always loved to read artist writings when I was a student. I really enjoyed it so much. I never really read catalogs from art historians, if I may say so. But I liked usually when artists write, because they write in a very different way. And I enjoyed that. And this is why I always urge my students, really express yourself. Like, in the beginning it's hard, but you will see it gets better, and then you start enjoying it.
Mm. Another question from you guys? Yes?
Sorry. You didn't let me know where to go?
Yeah. Oh. Yes, please.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for your talk. I don't know if I understood correctly, but from what you say, many of these collectives that you presented are going to take part in the Documenta.
Not all of them. These are collectives from Southeast Asia, so some of them are there, others not.
Okay.
But it's just to give a bit, they will have collectives from all over the world, also individual artists, not just collectives. But so it's a lot of more group activities.
Okay, but I was wondering, these collectives are really really regional, really local, and really engaging with small communities. And the Documenta is such an international, big, massive event, and I couldn't help but to relate to another thing that we were talking in a previous class, the one from Ariel, that he was really bothered by this documentary theater that appeared here, and like, what are, for example, your expectations for presenting these collectives in the Documenta, and for people not only to look at them and say, okay, this is interesting, and go away, but to generate something apart from that?
I'm very curious about the same thing. How can it function when you come from a particular place, and how can you translate this? So, yeah, I'm also very curious. So we will see, does this function, or like, I'm pretty sure it will, knowing them. But I think it will be much more participatory. It will be a very different experience for the visitors. But this massive scale of audience, how that will function, I'm equally curious.
Okay.
Yes, please.
So will the collectives that get displayed in the Documenta will also be there, like the people? Yeah.
Some of them are already there since months.
Yeah.
And then what is also very interesting, of course, they also work at home. So what Ruan Grupa wanted is not just that they come to Kassel and then everything happens in Kassel, but some of the money also gets distributed back to where they are. So, you know, that they get more infrastructure, that Kassel kind of is a subvention for what they do at home, because, I mean, they give something to Kassel, so something should be also given to them back home. That was another thing which was heavily discussed, like now they run away with our money. So
Yes, please.
So thanks again for the talk. And I wanted to ask a bit about maybe the practice of subversion in the curatorial process. So in which ways do you think you can actually, or is it in your experience that you can actually reach out? You talked also about how you always tend to build relationships with the people you work with, and how maybe have you had any experiences where these personal relationships didn't happen because you were working with very different people who have very different mindsets, but that still had something that was interesting even if you didn't share these spaces? And do you think that this is also something that can be sort of pushed forward or looked for? Because it seems that maybe sometimes the act of curation is kind of being a catalyst for what is going on in a society, so talking about the things that are being talked about, important to a society at a given moment. But how do you think this role can maybe advance things and bring things to the table that are not maybe on the table?
I mean, first of all, it's very difficult to do this in the bigger formats. I mean, like, for example, when we did Documenta, when you install, you meet the artists. I mean, we had 118 artists. You see them occasionally, you know, yeah, because you install a massive exhibition, and so you don't have this relationship that you have like when there is a smaller project. For example, now with Istanbul Biennale, we haven't even met. Amar was now for the first time in Istanbul in his life because we couldn't travel. So many of the artists we only know by Zoom. You know, each of us always knows them, but like the others haven't met them, and so that's really very difficult. So we really wonder how will that function at the end of the day, because it's also, a lot of this is also built on trust. You know, if you have these processes, you try to experiment or to try to do something, you have to trust the other person. Or like for example, we asked the artists to come up with proposals because we didn't want to have ready work. So, but we don't know what they bring. You know, like, so that is this kind of like unknown parts. So I think you have to be very open. And I think, of course, it's very different if you work with a smaller group, you know, like, because then you can really engage with each other, you go deeper, and like you exchange with each other. But the moment it gets bigger, it's almost, you need to know the people already, so they trust you because they worked with you in the past on smaller projects, and then you all agree to do the bigger format together. But it's, how to say, like, it's not that easy, I would say, in a bigger context. So it's actually quite good just to test it with some of your peers and just sometimes try to do something together. I mean, we made films together, which was really interesting because the moment you work together, you know, like, it's a collective work, but you also want that it is something that you want to have, you know, like you have to fight, you have to argue, because you still want to feel it's part of you, you're there, or like it represents you. And I think that is the really interesting kind of like thing that happens, this negotiation. It helps you also if you work individually. I do a lot myself, and many of my peers from our artist group, they're all individual, either stage designer or artists. But it really helped them to bring their practice forward. Don't know if I answered your question.
Another final question from anyone? Yes, in the very back. Maybe, yes.
I'm not sure.
And you have to speak up probably quite loud, all the way back there.
My question is if you know if there are some collectors who is like community-based work and have this responsibility, who decide
I think it's very different from group to group. You know, some really work with communities, like you have here what I showed before, Elan, who works with these women weavers, or Mata Asienza, who now works with the local community on the plastic recycling. But then, for example, in Documenta, we also had the Bataille Monument by Thomas Hirschhorn. And Thomas was very clear, he's not a social worker, like, it's his artwork. He was very clear to the people participating. He said, like, I'm disappearing after Documenta, I'm here 100 days, I'm gone, I will not engage with you afterwards. He was very straightforward, what is this? And he said, you're part of my artwork. You know, so what I think is important to be very clear, what's the relationship that you have with the community? And I agree, there are projects, they would never bring this, I mean, they wouldn't exhibit this, because, I mean, you don't want to expose the community. I think it really depends for the project. So, for example, with Ilan, they decide together, do they want to present this work? Also, when they sell the work, it goes to everybody. So you have to, at the moment you work in a group or with a community, you have to be very clear, because it can also become quickly quite exploitative in a way. So you're the artist who does this, but what is with the people who work with you? But I think most of these groups are quite aware.
Maybe now a question about a personal curiosity, since I was just thinking, actually while you were talking, I was thinking you taught for almost a decade, or a decade in Vienna, then you taught basically a decade at MIT, and now since 10 years in Singapore. Myself being very curious about artistic education, how would you define the kind of differences between these 3 decades of teaching? Europe, Vienna, US, MIT, Singapore.
I mean, Vienna was an art school, so we were the theory department of an art school, and we had a masterclass system, so the artists would be with one professor for the entire time and engage in a long period with one artist, and then having theory or like gender studies or whatever in the theory department. MIT, it was a bit of a shock for me first when I went there, because I realized we don't have art students. We actually teach art, but to all of the MIT students. So I had quite amazing peers. I was teaching with John Jonas, with Chista Wodichko, and with Muntadas, Renee Green. I mean, quite established artists, but our students would take classes. They come from astrophysics or marine biology. And in the beginning, it was really a shock for me. What do I do with the students who they come once a week for 3 hours for 1 term, and then I will never see them again? You know, so, I mean, we had also a master course, but that was only 6 students then. So that was a real shift until I really also realized, I mean, how much a benefit to talk from people in other disciplines, and how, you know, like I was teaching alongside Joan Jonas, and it was amazing because she was teaching performance to architects, and because we were part of the architecture department. And our colleagues in architecture, they always said, like, why do architects need to do performance? And she said, I was like, how do you know how a person acts in space? As an architect, you have to understand, what does a space do to people? Yeah, so it's very interesting. So I really also learned a different kind of teaching non-artists. And then in Singapore, we're teaching mainly museum studies and cultural practice, because it doesn't exist in the whole region, so we were the first course. And I would call it a turbo master. I'm not so happy about that. It's only 1 year. And it's very hard because most of them didn't have art history or anything before. But it's what is allowed, you know, like everything is has to be very quick, very applied. So we try to mentor some of the students and keep them later coming to us as trainees, and so the ones where we see there is a potential. So, and actually the normal teaching, I'm only teaching the master and PhD students there, but like my colleagues who are teaching BA is very much like a school. I mean, like I could not teach this in Asia, and you really tell the students what to do. You have to do this, and then you write this, and then by this day you read this. It's for me that's a horror. I call it salami slice technique. It's, you know, like it's not for me, and so I'm glad I don't need to teach BA there. And is very different than from our education. Yeah, we didn't learn anything really, but we learned to teach ourselves in a way.
Now we're coming to the last question. This is already good advice here. Learn to teach yourself. The last question for each speaker that I ask is, could you share a piece of advice with these becoming architects, musicians, artists, designers, etc.? One piece of advice.
I think what is amazing, which didn't exist when we were studying, is Erasmus or go one term abroad or a year. I think just go into another context and another way of teaching. Just you understand then what your school is here and then what is it elsewhere, and just being confronted with a different environment, with a different maybe understanding of the arts. And I mean, we would go ourselves, as I said, like we would work in the holidays and then go to New York and so like, but it didn't exist what we have today. And I think that is really something really wonderful that this is happening now, that you can take a semester abroad. I really urge everybody to make use of this. Later is very difficult, and to spend a term is different than 2 weeks. You know, just to immerse yourself in a different context.
Great. Thank you so much, Ute. A warm applause for Ute.
Thank you.
A warm applause for our amazing Studium Generale team who's making everything happen again. And a warm applause to you guys. On another note, we will be seeing each other in 2 weeks again. And in 2 weeks, we have artist Dina El-Kaisi-Friemuth with us. She is an artist based here in Berlin that works again mainly in collectives, so it's kind of a continuation of Ute's talk today. She's also founder of the FCNN, the Feminist Collective with No Name, and that's going to be in 2 weeks from now. Thanks for being here, and again, thank you, Ute.